of course, I read your book and I liked very much. And in the book, you wrote about how episodes of anxiety and depression are normal. And not many people say this. And how our fears have been created a long time ago. So can you explain a little bit more about this? When did we create that we are here and in depression?
Right. So what I think has shaped human psychology and human mental health more than anything else is the fact that half of all humans died before they became teenagers. And that wasn't the case for almost every generation who have lived. During 99.9% of our time on the planet, people died. Half of us died before we became teenagers, and we did not die from cardiovascular disease or cancer, which kills us today, but we died from dehydration, murder, infection, starvation, accidents. And that means that we are the descendants of the people who did not die from that, of course, before they had children themselves. And they probably saw the world as dangerous, because to survive in this terribly dangerous world, which we have evolved for, if you see a lot of danger, that will help you plan for the worst. And today we call planning for the worst and seeing danger everywhere as anxiety. And we call withdrawing from the world as depression. And I think that those states are defense mechanisms that has helped humans survive in our history. About half of the risk of becoming anxious or depressed comes from your genes. It's set when you are born. And when I try to explain this to my patients, that it's not strange that there are people who are anxious. What is strange is there are people who are not anxious, and maybe they are the ones who should be diagnosed. And when I tell it like that to my patients, some of them realize that there's nothing wrong with me. I am not damaged. I am not broken goods. And just contextualizing a period of anxiety or depression in a different way, where you understand that this has nothing to do with my character. It's not about pulling myself up. It's a defense mechanism that has helped humans to survive. That in itself is a very important thing for many people, I've realized. And by this, I don't want to downplay the trauma, the damage that depressions and anxiety cause, because they are hell. They cost lives and they lead to tremendous suffering. But just to understand it from a slightly different perspective and realize that you are not damaged, that's very important. And I often say that a strong pair of arms, they could lift heavy things into the air, and a strong pair of legs, they can run fast. But a strong brain is not a brain that goes through periods of stress unaffected. It's a brain that wants you to survive at all costs, even if it paints a very dangerous world, even though the world isn't dangerous, so to speak. And that is important in today's world to know, because 280 million individuals have anxiety, according to the World Health Organization. And in my country, Sweden, 1 in 8 adults are being prescribed antidepressant medication. And as a psychiatrist, I have often thought that, am I contributing to making 1/8 of all adults feeling sick and damaged? And that was something I wanted to get to the core at in this book I wrote.
Okay. And you are writing also about the importance of exercise for our mental health, but also how exercise seems unimportant to us because it won't solve our problems, and also how it is inherent in our nature to be lazy. Are we lazy? And why is that so?
Yes, so these are very important questions. And when our brain creates feelings, it doesn't just use what's happening around us in our senses, what we see and hear and smell, but it's also using information from the body. And it's a part of the brain that's called the insular cortex. It's in your temporal lobe. It's in this part of the brain. And in that part of the brain, information from your senses and from your body is connected. And from that connection of your inner and outer world, the brain creates feelings. So the important thing to know here is that your internal world, what's happening in your organs, is very important for feelings. And we know now today that exercise basically strengthens all the body's organs. And that means that the brain gets better signals from your body when it creates feelings. And it means that it increases the chances of the brain creating unpleasant feelings. We also know now from many studies that exercise protects against depressions. And that's very strange. I mean, there's been a study done where people had to cycle on a treadmill or bike for 6 minutes. And then they had to grab a handle as hard as they could. And if I was to ask you, do you think that this cycle test and this handle test, the strength test, could say anything about your risk of becoming depressed from today until the year 2030? What would you say about that? Do you think that that your shape on this bike test has anything to do with your risk of being depressed?
Of course. And I think also food is very important.
Yeah.
Do we talk enough about the food, how food can influence our brain and our...
Yes, food is also very important, but of course, but the point is that most of us don't think that a cycle test will tell me if I will become depressed or not. This sounds very far-fetched, but it turns out that more than 100,000 individuals in the UK had to do this cycle test. It turned out 7 years after that the ones who were in good shape, they had lower risk of becoming depressed, and they were also lower risk of becoming anxious. And I think and this has been shown in many studies, and I think that you should look at it as exercise gives the brains better signals from your body, and that increases the chances of creating pleasant signals so that you feel good, basically. And we have made this distinction in our history between soul and body, and then that distinction turned to brain and body. And it sounds like the brain is just something that can be fixed by therapy or antidepressant medication, but it turns out the brain and the body cannot be separated. They are closely tied to one another, especially when it comes to creating feelings. And in that context, that's exactly how you should view exercise. And exercise has nothing to do with sport. It's got nothing to do with being good, one in the tennis team or whatever. It is something that we are built for. And it might as well be walking to work, riding your bike to work. It might be walking in stairs instead of taking the elevator and so on. But that sort of raises an interesting question. Okay, if exercise is so good for the body and for the brain and for our well-being, why then do we choose Netflix over going for a run? And the answer to that, the probable answer, is that we have not evolved to be happy. We have evolved to avoid starvation. And starvation has been a huge threat for almost every generation of humans. And starvation is the reason why calorie-rich food tastes so good. Because if our ancestors were lucky enough to run upon something on the savannah that contained a lot of calories, such as honey or fruit or something like that, they should feel an urge to eat everything. Take every piece of berry, take every drop of honey, because tomorrow you will not find any food. And they may be gone then. So that craving for calories, eat all you could find, that made a lot of sense in a world where there wasn't much calories, which was basically all our history. But that strategy does not make any sense at all at McDonald's. When you take this crave for calorie that evolution has built into us during millions of years in a calorie-poor world, where you put that into our world where calories are basically free, well, then you get the problems that you see today in terms of overweight and type 2 diabetes. And the amount of energy that your body has is not just dependent on how much food you eat, but also on how much energy you use. And it costs energy to move. That's why we are lazy. We want to stay in the couch. We should not waste our valuable energy. And some of you might think that well, if I'm overweight, I still have kilos. Why do my brains want to keep me still? I'm not threatened by starvation. And the probable answer to that is that we have never been overweight in our history. Overweight and obesity has been a non-existent problem during human evolution, but threatening starvation has been a huge problem. And that so we never evolved any defense mechanisms against overweight. The body and the brain interprets all weight loss, even if it's from a very high level, as threatening starvation. And then very powerful mechanisms kick into us. Our hunger increases when we lose weight and so on. So the point here is that we are lazy because we should be lazy. And if we could tell our ancestors that we go for a run and then we come back to the same place without accomplishing anything, and then we lift heavy things into the air and put them down again, going to the gym, our ancestors would think that we were crazy. You're nuts. Doing something so pointless as going for a run and going to the gym, that would be as stupid as throwing your food into the sea for almost every generation of humans. So the instinct that we have to be still in the couch is a very strong one, and it's something that we have to fight all the time if you want to feel good. And the point I always try to make here is that exercise has nothing to do with sport. It's something that we have to build into our lives so that it becomes a natural habit. So that it becomes something that we just do. We just brush our teeth every night. We don't think, should I brush my teeth tonight or not? We just do it. And in the same way, we should try to build exercise into our lives so that it just becomes a habit, so that we don't have to sort of negotiate with the lazy part of ourselves, because we will often lose that negotiation and end up in the Netflix sofa.
Yeah. So the last 3 years were very, not easy for millions and millions of people over in the whole world. So also not in Sweden, also not in Croatia, because of this COVID-19 pandemic. Yeah. And you brought a very interesting premise in your book, that the cause of depression can have its psychological roots in our relationship with viruses and bacteria, inflammation in our bodies, and then, of course, you mentioned also the COVID-19, and how we can use then this knowledge to our benefit. What do you think?
So we often view depressions in the context of our relation to other people, but I think we also have to view it as in the context of our relation to virus and bacteria. And that may sound very strange, but the reason for that is that half of all humans died before they became teenagers, as I said, and many of them died from infections. And that means that we have strong defense mechanisms against infections. And in order to understand what this has to do with depression, you have to understand the word inflammation. And the inflammation is basically the body's response to whatever is happening to it. If I scratch myself, this causes a small inflammation. If my pancreas ruptures and leaks enzymes into my intestines, which puts me into mortal danger, that's an infection. That's an inflammation. So inflammation is it's a concept. It's body's reaction against any kind of stimuli, basically. And what I think happens is that what caused inflammation in our history was probably infections to a large degree, and those killed us. And that kind of inflammation was probably rather short term. You have inflammation for a couple of days or so. But now our current lifestyle causes inflammation. A sedentary lifestyle causes inflammation. A lot of food, processed food, causes inflammation. Stress causes inflammation, and so on. So this inflammatory system is basically on longer than it evolved for. And that means that if we get signals of constant inflammation, the brain will interpret that as that we are in danger, because inflammation basically meant infections and stress and danger during all our history. And the brain evolved to help us survive. So how should it help us survive? If we're in danger, well, it wants us to get away from the world which it perceives as dangerous, and it drives down our motivation. And then we get depressed. And the depression is basically that everything feels pointless. So I think about a third of all depressions have been shown to have an inflammatory component. Not all of them, about a third. And that's probably an evolutionary defense mechanisms that the brain wants to keep you away from this world that it's perceiving as dangerous, and it drives down your motivation and you feel crappy. And this is, I think, if you really understand this, you will change your behavior somewhat. You will understand that, okay, if I eat a certain kinds of food, then there's a risk that my brain will misinterpret that as I'm being in a dangerous world. If I stress too much, my brain will interpret that as I'm in mortal danger, because that is what stress used to be, etc. If I don't exercise, then my brain will misinterpret that, and so on. So when you understand sort of on a deeper level how these lifestyle factors are transformed into your feelings, then you will make changes. That has been the way. That's been the way for me, at least, and for many of my patients. And that's why I think a deeper understanding of our biological nature can be very, very rewarding, because it answers a lot of these why questions. Why are we built that way, this way?
I had a few months ago a very interesting experience. I had a tooth infection. And I didn't know that I have a tooth infection, and I was not good. I was not well. Normally, I don't have anxiety and panic attacks, but it started then. And I asked myself, what's going on? Why I have now anxiety and panic attacks? And then after few weeks, it started to hurt. And then I realized it's a tooth infection. And when I fixed it, I was again okay. And everything went away with this anxiety. So I realized that it's very, very in connection.
Yes, that's many have had similar stories as you have, and many have felt down for a couple of hours after they have been vaccinated for COVID. And COVID vaccines are great; they are fantastic. But many experience that they feel down for a couple of minutes, hours. And I think that's because they get the inflammatory response, because the vaccines are evolved to or developed so that they should produce an inflammatory response. And your brain interprets that inflammatory response as danger, because that is what it used to mean. And when I was in med school, this is just 23 years ago, I was taught that the brain cannot get signals from the body in terms of inflammatory signals. That's not possible, because they will not get into the brain. But then it turned out about 20 years ago that it actually can, and it gets the signals from our body, and they get into the brain, and the brain uses them when it creates our mental state, or basically our well-being. So that's an example of how this division between brain and body is more and more and more eroded. And that means that we have to start looking at our mental health, not just from the perspective of our psychological factors around us, but also from the perspective of our physiological factors.
Okay. And what do you mean how this pandemic changed our mental health? And did it, because it's obvious that it did change.
Yes, it caused, of course, a lot of anxiety and depressions. It has not caused a lot of suicides, fortunately, at least not in Sweden. I think personally that it's not strange that this very, very deep fear that we have of infectious diseases, which is natural because so many of us died, when that fear was exposed to 24 hours a day digital information about viruses and hospitals and morgues that was filled with dead bodies, that caused enormous anxiety for many people. And to them, I always said that be very cautious on how much information you get on this. Read the news in the morning and do it at night. Do not check information about this on your phone during the day, because yes, it will create anxiety. And of course, everyone was not affected mentally. Some were lucky, people were not, but many of us were. And I think that this pandemic really highlighted not just the need for protection against further pandemics, but protection against mental health. It raised the awareness about mental health.
Yeah. And in the book, you talk about also about loneliness, and that in the world today, especially in Europe and in America, there is a pandemic of loneliness. What do you mean by this, and how does it? What does it have to do with this digital communication also? Because it's related. We are now. Even in a restaurant, two people are sitting, they are not talking, they are looking at their mobiles, and they are not together, they are as lonely.
Yeah.
So what do you mean? How we will change in 50 or 100 years because of that?
Well, no one can predict the future. I certainly can't do that, but I think that loneliness is also something you have to see from a physiological perspective, not just a psychological perspective. We know now that loneliness increases the risk of anxiety and depressions. Of course, that's not surprising. But what we've also seen is that loneliness leads to worse prognosis for all forms of cardiovascular disease. And it also is connected to increased risk of several forms of cancer. And that's very strange. I mean, why would loneliness be dangerous for the body? There's no logic to that. And the probable answer to that is that we humans did not survive by ourselves. We died if we were isolated. Being isolated meant certain death, and being part of a group was as important as having food. And that means that when you are isolated, when you're lonely for longer periods, you are in a state where humans died, where the world was even more dangerous. And then your stress system is increased. The level of stress in your body is increased. And that this long-term increase of stress is probably what is causing the worst prognosis for all forms of cardiovascular disease if you're lonely. Now, loneliness is also very subjective, so you can't measure loneliness. It's if you feel lonely, you are lonely, even though you don't have people around you. And I personally, I can have a lot of people around me and still feel lonely, and I can feel very connected, even though I don't meet anyone. So it's very subjective, and you can't, and it's not dangerous to be lonely for a couple of days. That's unavoidable. It's this long-term loneliness, weeks and months and so on. And I think what's happening is that in our digital era, we're replacing a lot of face-to-face meetings with digital interactions. And of course, we can replace some of it, but not all of it, because we are a social animal, and our social needs evolved for meeting face-to-face. And I think that we can't just substitute that for screens. Then we risk feeling lonely, and we risk starting this cycle that leads to what the brain perceives as basically a threat, and our stress system is increased. So we have to consider loneliness as a big solution to our mental health problem, in the same way that exercise is a solution to that.
Because touching each other is also, I think, very important. Not only seeing each other, but also touching, because baby can survive without food few days, but without touching, it's not good for a baby. So I think this is also something we have inside us forever.
Absolutely. I agree 100% that we have receptors in our skin that they are most strongly activated if you stroke with a speed of 3 to 4 centimeters per second, like this. And that's a touch. I mean, why would evolution put those receptors into us? They don't respond to cold, they don't respond to heat, they don't respond to pain or anything else. They just respond to light touch. And I think you get the understanding of why, if you follow these receptors way into the brain, where they release endorphins, and endorphins create a feeling of pleasure, and also bonds to people together. And that's just an example of how our strong social needs evolved during millions and millions of years of meeting in real life, interpreting each other's body language, touching each other. And when we don't get that, we are in a state that was mortally dangerous to us historically, and then we feel stressed and don't feel as good.
So you say that we feel so bad today because we have forgotten that we are indeed biological beings. On the other hand, you say that to find true happiness, we have to find what is important to us, and happiness will come as a byproduct.
Yeah.
Do you have any advice how to help ourselves and truly find these truly important things in our busy life we all have?
Happiness is a very tricky subject because everyone has his or her own interpretation of the word. But one of my advice is at least to don't give a damn about happiness. Don't even think of that word, because happiness is for most people constant pleasurable feelings that you feel good all the time, basically. And we are not built to feel good all the time. We're built to survive. And if our ancestors felt good all the time, well, then they would not be motivated to seek new food or anything else. So feelings of pleasure should be short-term from the perspective of the brain. But in our modern society, we get all this advertisement, all this social media is telling us that, you should feel fantastic all the time. And if you don't, there's something wrong with you. And we are not evaluating our lives from the basis of what's happening in our lives. We're evaluating our lives from our expectations. If we start expecting that we will be happy all the time, we will constantly go lower than our expectations, so to speak. So this modern view on happiness, that it's constant pleasure, it puts the level of our expectations too high. So, and by that, I just want to say that don't give a damn about any YouTube lectures about happiness or any self-advice on it, because, you'll probably feel bad from just hearing about this, because you will start comparing your life to something that is not obtainable. And if I were to say personally what I think gives happiness, it's contributing to something that is bigger than yourself. And that could be your family, that could be your work, that could be many things. I have probably as many answers to that as there are people in the world. But short-term pleasure is not one of those answers. So I think that you should really ask yourself, what gives meaning in my life? And sort of follow that. And if you do that, then happiness, or whatever you want to call it, will come as a byproduct of that.
Thank you for this. I also mean this. And thank you for this interview. And thank you for the book. And I hope we can see you maybe in Croatia, that we can see each other and meet in real, not like this as digital.
Yeah, I would love to.
Okay, we invite you.
Okay, good.
Hope to see you.
Yeah, I'd love to.
Yeah, thank you for this interview.
Thank you, my pleasure.
It will help many people who have problems with all this question we raised today. Have a nice day.
You too.
And hope see you soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye.